The morning, like any other. Bread baked, stone ovens. Merchants counted coins in bustling ports. Kings sent letters to one another, calling each other brother, bound by treaties that had lasted for generations. And then, within the span of a single human lifetime, it all came apart. Cities that had stood for 500 years turned to ash. Trade routes that stretched across the entire Mediterranean simply vanished. Written language itself disappeared from entire regions, not to return for centuries. Kings who once ruled empires vanished so completely that we don't even know their names. This isn't the fall of Rome. It isn't the fall of an empire you've heard endless documentaries about. This older, deeper, stranger, historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. But to the people who lived through it, it must have felt like something far simpler and far more terrifying. The end of the world. Around 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was home to one of the most interconnected civilizations the ancient world had ever produced. The Egyptians ruled the Nile with godlike authority. The Hittites controlled a vast empire across Anatolia. The Mycenaeans built palace cities in Greece filled with gold, weapons, and elaborate bureaucracies. Cyprus supplied copper. The Levant supplied timber, textiles, and trade routes connecting everyone else. These weren't isolated kingdoms. They were part of a system, a network of alliances, marriages, and trade agreements so sophisticated that some archaeologists compare it to an early form of globalization. Letters uncovered from this era show kings negotiating grain shipments during famine, exchanging royal daughters in marriage, and even trading physicians between courts. For centuries, this system worked. It created wealth, art, architecture, and some of the earliest known systems of law and diplomacy. And then, according to archaeological evidence, within roughly 50 years, nearly every major city in this network was destroyed, abandoned, or reduced to a fraction of its former size. Try to imagine that scale of collapse today. Imagine New York, London, Tokyo, and Cairo all falling into ruin within the same few decades, their populations scattered, their governments dissolved, their written records lost. That is the scope historians are describing when they talk about the Bronze Age collapse. So what actually happened? That question has haunted historians for over a century, and the honest answer is, we still don't fully know. What we have are clues: burned palaces, abandoned cities, cryptic inscriptions, and one mysterious group of people who appear again and again in the ruins. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. We don't know exactly who they were. We don't know precisely where they came from. What we do know, according to Egyptian temple inscriptions, is that a coalition of seafaring groups swept across the Mediterranean, attacking coastal cities and, in some cases, entire kingdoms. Pharaoh Ramesses III left behind detailed reliefs at Medinet Habu describing a massive naval battle against these invaders. The imagery shows chaotic ship-to-ship combat, drowning warriors, and what appears to be a decisive Egyptian victory. But even in claiming triumph, the inscriptions hint at just how close Egypt came to falling like everyone else around it. Some historians suggest the Sea Peoples were displaced populations fleeing collapsing regions elsewhere, refugees turned raiders out of desperation, rather than conquerors with a grand plan. Others propose they may have included groups later associated with the Philistines, the Sicilians, or peoples from the Aegean. The evidence? Debated. And that uncertainty is part of what makes this era so haunting. We are looking at the wreckage of a civilization-ending event, and we still can't say with certainty who or what delivered the final blow. Because here's the twist that changes everything. Most modern researchers no longer believe the Sea Peoples alone caused the collapse. Increasingly, archaeologists argue they may have been a symptom of the crisis, not its root cause. Something else was already destabilizing the region before a single ship ever reached the shore. And that something else might be the most unsettling explanation of all. Around this time, climate data pulled from ancient pollen samples, cave deposits, and sediment cores suggests the eastern Mediterranean experienced a prolonged period of drought. Some researchers propose this drought lasted decades, severely disrupting agriculture across an already fragile system. Bronze Age kingdoms depended heavily on centralized grain storage and redistribution. Palaces weren't just political centers, they were economic lifelines, controlling food supplies for entire populations. If harvests failed repeatedly, and if trade routes bringing in grain from elsewhere were disrupted at the same time, the very system designed to protect people could become the mechanism of their unraveling. Add to this the fact that Bronze Age economies depended almost entirely on tin and coppens, tools, and armor, materials that had to be transported across vast distances through an intricate trade network. If even a few key links in that chain broke, due to warfare, piracy, or simple supply disruption, the effects could cascade outward with devastating speed. This is what some historians now call a systems collapse, the idea that no single cause destroyed this civilization. Instead, multiple pressures, drought, famine, trade disruption, and invasion arrived together, overwhelming a system that had never been designed to withstand so many shocks at once. Picture a chain of dominoes stretching across an entire region. Knock down one, and the rest might have held. But knock down 5 simultaneously: drought, famine, invasion, trade collapse, and internal rebellion, and even the mightiest kingdoms had no chance to recover. At Ugarit, a wealthy trading city on the Syrian coast, archaeologists discovered something chilling. Letters left mid-sentence, arrowheads embedded in walls, and evidence the city burned so violently it was never resettled. One letter found in the ruins reads like a desperate plea for military reinforcements that likely never arrived in time. In Greece, the mighty palace centers of the Mycenaean civilization, places later immortalized in Homeric legend, were abandoned almost simultaneously. Linear B writing, the script used by Mycenaean scribes to track palace economies, disappeared entirely. For nearly 4 centuries afterward, Greece entered what historians often call a dark age, a period with little writing, reduced population, and simplified material culture. Think about that for a moment. The heroes of the Trojan War, if such events even had historical roots, may have belonged to one of the very last generations before their entire civilization went dark, its writing forgotten, its cities buried, its stories surviving only through oral memory until Homer eventually gave them epic form centuries later. The Hittite Empire, once a superpower rivaling Egypt, simply vanishes from the historical record around this time. Its capital, Hattusa, was abandoned and partially burned. To this day, researchers debate whether it fell to invasion, internal collapse, or a combination of political fragmentation and resource scarcity. Even Egypt, the survivor of this era, emerged deeply wounded. Though it repelled the Sea Peoples, the empire that followed was noticeably smaller, poorer, and less powerful than before. The golden age of the pharaohs, temples overflowing with tribute, foreign kings sending gifts and daughters, was over. What's remarkable is how quickly literacy itself became a casualty of this collapse. In several regions, Writing systems disappeared almost entirely for generations. Bureaucratic record-keeping, taxation systems, diplomatic correspondence, all the invisible infrastructure that makes complex civilization possible, dissolved along with the palaces that once needed them. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson of the Bronze Age collapse. Advanced civilization is not permanent. It is not guaranteed. It depends on fragile, interconnected systems that can unravel far faster than they were built. We tend to imagine history as a steady climb upward, technology improving, societies growing more sophisticated over time. But the late Bronze Age collapse challenges that assumption directly. For nearly 3 centuries afterward, much of the Eastern Mediterranean experienced smaller populations, simpler technology, and reduced trade compared to what had existed before. It would take generations for cities to rebuild, for writing to re-emerge in new forms, and for new powers, eventually including the early Greek city-states, and later the Phoenicians and Assyrians, to rise from the wreckage of what had been lost. And this is where the story becomes even more layered. Some historians argue that the collapse, as devastating as it was, also cleared the way for entirely new political and cultural systems to emerge. The rigid, centralized palace economies of the Bronze Age gave way, over time, to more decentralized, adaptable societies. The Phoenicians developed an alphabet that would eventually influence Greek and Latin systems used across the world today. Ironworking, once a rare luxury reserved for palace elites during the Bronze Age, spread more widely as bronze trade networks broke down, ushering in the technological shift historians call the Iron Age. In other words, the end of one world may have planted the seeds for a very different one to grow. But we should be careful not to romanticize catastrophe. For the people who actually lived through this collapse, it wasn't a symbolic turning point in a textbook. It was famine. It was war. It was watching cities that had stood for centuries burn in a matter of days. It was children growing up without ever learning to read, in a world where their grandparents had once written poetry and diplomatic treaties. Current research indicates the true trigger of the Bronze Age collapse involved a combination of factors arriving in close succession: environmental stress from prolonged agricultural failure disrupted trade networks, internal uprisings possibly caused by widening inequality, and external pressure from displaced or invading groups collectively known as the Sea Peoples. No single explanation fully satisfies the evidence on its own. Some historians emphasize climate above all else. Others point to systemic economic fragility. Still others argue military invasion delivered the final, fatal blow to societies already weakened by internal crisis. The evidence remains debated, and honestly, that may be the most historically accurate way to understand it. Because complex collapses rarely have simple causes, and the Bronze Age teaches us something profoundly relevant even today. Interconnected systems, ones that bring prosperity and progress, can also transmit crisis with terrifying speed. A drought in one region, a famine follows, a trade route disrupted, a wave of desperate migration, each factor amplifying the next until an entire civilization simply can't hold itself together anymore. It's a pattern historians have noticed echoing throughout later collapses as well, though the Bronze Age remains one of the earliest and most dramatic examples we have physical evidence for. Today, when archaeologists walk through the ruins of Ugarit or Hattusa, or the burned palace floors of Mycenae, they're not just looking at old stones. They're looking at the remnants of a warning, a reminder that even the mightiest civilizations, the ones that feel permanent, unshakable, eternal, exist within systems that can break. And maybe that's the most haunting part of this story. Not that civilization fell, but how quickly it happened, and how little warning the people living through it may have had. We often assume history moves in straight lines, that progress is permanent, that once a society reaches a certain level of sophistication, it simply continues climbing forward. But the Late Bronze Age collapse reminds us that history doesn't always move that way. Sometimes it moves backward violently and reshapes the future in ways no one living through the chaos could have possibly predicted. The people of the Bronze Age had no idea they were living through what we now call a turning point in human history. They didn't know their kingdoms would vanish from memory for thousands of years, only to be rediscovered by archaeologists piecing together fragments of clay tablets, burned foundations, and cryptic inscriptions. So when we look back at this collapse today, drought data hidden in ancient pollen, warnings buried in royal letters begging for help that never arrived, cities abandoned mid-meal, mid-sentence, mid-life, we're not just studying the past. We're studying a mirror. A reflection of how fragile even the most advanced, interconnected societies can be when multiple pressures converge at once. So here's the question worth sitting with. If a network of civilizations that lasted for centuries, with sophisticated trade, diplomacy, and writing, could collapse within a single generation, what does that tell us about the systems we depend on today? What do you think truly caused the Bronze Age world to fall? Climate, invasion, internal collapse, or all three colliding at once? Let us know your theory in the comments below.